Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and we're here to talk about how do we build a more empathic society. And I'm here today with Mary Goyer. Hi, Mary. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
Would you like to just introduce yourself a bit about your background and what you
Sure,
do? And
sure. Yeah, so my background is in clinical counseling and therapy. I have a one-on-one practice. I work with clients, primarily executives, leaders, people that are very mission driven and wanting support with whatever kinds of inner game things might be impacting their capacity to make the changes that they want to in the world or even in their careers. And I also teach conscious communication, both one-on-one and organizationally. I offer trainings for teams and groups, and I use a lot of nonviolent communication as my sort of the main body of work. I kind of have my own spin on certain things, and I introduce mind-body concepts into it. But yeah, I'm very passionate about empathy and the ways in which really skilled conscious empathy can have huge leverage power for changing all kinds of relationships, for resourcing any one person when they're starting to feel drained or having challenges in their careers, in their activism, in their personal relationships as well, certainly. And so, yeah, I'm really glad to be here to kind of talk a little bit more about some of the things that empathy can do.
yeah, and you've just come out with a new edition of this book, The Healing Power of Empathy, the true stories about transforming relationships. And I'm very
Yeah.
excited about it since I have a story in there as well. So,
Yeah, you're one of my authors in this anthology.
yeah, it's great. How did
Yeah.
you come about write this or, edit this book or even conceive it?
Yeah, so this came up as I was teaching in BC. I was really noticing how often, especially when people learn some of the basic frameworks in nonviolent communication, there's even sort of a joke in the NVC community about how formulaic it can sound, how robotic it can sound when you're just kind of plugging into the basic formula or recipe. And what I noticed is that really what students wanted were more examples of what it really sounds like when you bring the NVC consciousness and have the basic form in there, but what does it sound like conversationally? Like what's really possible? And also, like, so one, it was about like offering more examples and starting to think about like, wow, if I just ask some of the different NVC trainers that I love, some of my mentors, like what are their favorite teaching examples that demonstrate these concepts in life, and that also let people see just how impactful NVC can be, especially in situations, many of which the book demonstrate are between NVC people and non-NVC people. So that was the other thing, is people were asking like, but how do you do this, and what do you expect when you're not talking with somebody who has any particular communication skills? What can I expect then? So I really wanted to hold both of those intentions, showing examples of what the skills sound like when they're more integrated, and also to show people how effective it can be when you're using it with regular people.
Well,
So
stories are so powerful, and
yeah.
can't think of any other books that have like real personal, like a lot of personal storytelling like this. I see it as a huge contribution to just share stories of people's experience actually offering or using empathy to deal with personal problems, to deal with healing, to deal
Yeah.
with relationships. So yeah, it's
Yeah. Well, I feel like, I agree. I think that stories really stand alone as teaching tools. My background way back, I started off my career as a middle school teacher
Mm.
and a reading specialist, and so I love the way that, that stories can be the thing that provide them more inspiration for learning. And really do demonstrate, people can read these stories, even people that are brand new to NVC that don't know some of the basic frameworks can read these stories and really kind of begin to grok the consciousness, and get a sense of like, oh, I see what they're doing here. I
Hmm.
see what's happening. And the stories are, what I love about them, when I'm reading them is it's very, it's kind of a la Chicken Soup for the Soul, those little anecdotes, little vignettes that are just heartwarming and inspiring, so they're easy to access, even for people that don't typically like to read nonfiction. It's just like, wow, oh, these sweet little stories I can read a couple before bed, and really, in sort of this sort of stealthy way, are developing a very robust skill set.
Yeah, and it really moves people too. Like I didn't put that. It's not the story I put into the book, but I tell a story often about how I mediated a family conflict. Two family members were kind of going at each other, judging each other, pointing fingers,
Yeah.
and I started just doing empathic listening with one of them, then with the other, kind of in real time, kind of going back and forth, just listening. And as they were heard, they started calming down to the point where I asked them to do empathic listening with each other, saying, I just reflect back what you're hearing the other person say till they feel heard. You'll get your chance to be heard. And, it went back and forth, and they started, hearing each other better. There was still plenty of tension, but then the whole family gathered around, and we started doing like a family empathy circles, mutual empathic listening. And it's
Wow.
just like the conflict, the onion, the layers kind of just got
Mm-hmm.
deeper and deeper to the point where the real issue was no longer the specific thing that had happened, where the
Right.
gifts were being kept, but it was about belonging. I don't feel like I belong in the family. I don't feel like I'm accepted. And sort of a connection was created.
Mm-hmm.
Another family member said, you belong, I love you, and all this, and big hugs.
Mm-hmm.
And so a real healing. And when I tell that story, I usually tell it in, more detail. I can
Yeah.
just see people like, they can, they're
Yeah.
really moved by this story. So, the
Yeah.
story of the power of storytelling is just
Yeah.
amazing.
Well, it's I mean, kind of like what you're saying, in these very informal situations, like there's situations in the book where people are encountering strangers and offering empathy to de-escalate violence. There's stories, people often ask me, especially since I work often in, offering trainings and in organizations, like, well, realistically, can I do this stuff with my boss? And it's like, well, yeah, I'll actually like read little snippets of the stories to people during trainings. I have it
Mm.
like kind of integrated with my content, to say like, here is an example of a bullying boss, and how one person from that power under position, um, you know, she actually got voted by her coworkers to be the one to try to speak up and see if they could make a change in the way that they were being managed. And it's just like when everyday people realize that you can use this and you don't have to be this NVC master, in order to be effective. Like it's just like these are real people in everyday situations, and I think it offers a lot of hope and a lot of efficacy,
Mm.
a lot of like agency, like, wow, like this horrible thing's going on in my family, and this, this conversation, whatever the fight was initially about, and I can actually do something that's effective, rather than what most of us have learned, because we have such a limited communication skill set based on, just our cultural training. Most of us have learned to kind of just avoid and throw our hands up and just, try to try to ignore it until it passes, you know, and
Sweep it under the rug. The
sweep it
different
under the
issues.
rug.
Yeah.
Yeah. And avoiding, if you don't have a skill set, avoiding seems like a pretty reasonable strategy, you know, and I would argue that it is in that case. But it's like, wow, once people get a sense of really simple things that can be said, you know, and read these stories and go like, wow, you know, like, my gosh, you know, like when, you know, two people were arguing on the streets in New York and this woman just walked up and said a couple of words to the person who was most triggered. And suddenly, you know, you feel that sense of tension kind of relaxing. This is the thing for me. Like, this is part of what gets me so lit up. Maybe you can even see it right now.
Yeah, I see it.
But the ways in which like everyday people step into their leadership, step into their empowerment. And, you know, as more and more people do that, this is what it's going to take to really change the planet and change like some of the systems that are so painful for all of us. You know, these are the ways we can start to do that.
Do you have a story, your own story is there one that you like to tell that if you want to share, you know, just
Yeah.
maybe?
Yeah. Well, the one that's like really on my mind right now, I was just sort of sharing with you before we started recording that that both of my parents actually have dementia. My father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's several years ago, and my mom since has been more general dementia, has a diagnosis. And so we're going through all these things. They're both now in care facilities, and you know, I have been leaning on my empathy skills a lot because both of them have different ways in which they remember things. And, you know, my dad's has more advanced Alzheimer's on the one hand, but he has a better short-term memory. And my mom is more functional in terms of taking care of herself and showering and all of these things. But her short-term memory, she, you know, like resets every hour sometimes. And so as they're talking about things and getting upset because they think we're not telling them things, or wanting choice, you know, wanting independence, wanting some sense of autonomy, I wrote a story in the book about dignity. And, you know, as I was processing, when my father was pretty newly diagnosed, where I was just so upset and couldn't quite figure it out. And when I received empathy, you know, my partner said, you know, like, does this all really come down to dignity? You know, and, you know, I was talking with lots of people at the time about my grief process, and most of them were saying, well, you know, it's going to be hard. You know, they're giving platitudes or giving some advice, or, you know, doing these things that in the NVC world we call empathy knots. You know, they're sometimes welcome. In this case, like it wasn't particularly helpful. And I was sort of just like, oh, this isn't working, until it was just like, you really care about dignity. And I was like, oh, yes, I so care about their dignity that even I want to know that even as, in this case, it was just my dad at the time, but now my mom too, like as things advance, that there's dignity, and that they're treated in a way that they still have a sense of being cared about and their humanity being seen.
So it was your partner who was who was there to offer empathic listening to you and really give you space so you could really, you know, discover and share what was a really deeper value or need that you have. And sounds like just being able to identify that and express it, you just created some relief.
It was so powerful. I remember at the time, I mean, it was several years ago now, but at the time, like for days, I just was walking around going like, dignity. Yes, that's what it is. Because it's not like anything had there was no problem solving to do at the time. You know, it's just like, this terrible thing's going to happen. We don't know when, and we don't exactly know how. And it was so heavy, and it was really a surprise for me to find out that just being connected to that need for dignity was enough to just like open my chest and make it easier to breathe. And I for days walked around. And now that were, you know, much, much further along in the process, I still remember that. And I continue to go like, okay, what do I care about? I care about dignity. What would dignity look like right now?
Mm.
You know, and now it's become kind of an organizing principle for me in this really challenging situation, you know, that like, okay, well, let me ask for this special thing to happen for my dad in this care facility. They don't normally do this, but to me, this would be about dignity. And so it's helped me to make certain requests, and it's helped me to also remember the one thing that's so hard with somebody in this disease. And, you know, I don't know if you have any experience with this or not, is it's really tempting when people have memory issues to try to correct them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they'll say like, well, you didn't tell me that. And I'm thinking, I told you that 10 minutes ago. I told you exactly that, you know? And so dignity helps me to remember that, you know, every now and then I do want to tell them like, well, I want you to know that I have been keeping you in the loop. We talked about this yesterday. You know, you can see it's on the calendar, you know, whatever. But I am much better, not always. I am much better about starting off with empathy, because that is like, yeah, you must be furious thinking that you're being left out of the decision-making process for your own life. Yeah, that would absolutely enrage me. Of course you want choice. Of course you want to be in the loop. You know, that makes total sense. And then they go, thank you. You know, thank you. And then we can actually kind of get back into the content once they feel like I'm listening and I get it. And once I feel like I'm listening and I get it, you know, then it's usually a much more powerful process moving forward, you know.
Yeah.
So that one comes to mind because I happen to be so in it right now, you know, and giving empathy to the caregivers, you know, like I can be upset with them because they forgot to do this, this, and this. And, you know, we thought we were clear and there was this miscommunication. And it's like, the last thing I want to do is alienate them, you know, with my anger. And so connecting with empathy first, like, okay, so you're feeling confused, you're feeling overwhelmed, you're, you know, like, all right, I got it. And then like, are you up for reflecting what you're hearing is important to me? You know, doing this basic, you know, it goes into other NVC skills, but
so it's really a way of being. You're doing it with your family. You're receiving the empathy, and you're also with the caregivers. Sounds like you're offering it, and then you're also requesting it. So it's creating a whole environment, and each of those is a story, right? It's like
that's right.
Each one of those, when you're receiving empathy, there's a story of the experience of it, and so the beauty of it. There's the offering of it is another story. So we're like surrounded with these stories of empathy.
Yeah, and circling back to the book, there's one of the things in this second edition of The Healing Power of Empathy. It was formerly titled Empathy Stories, and the second edition is more robust, and it has a lot more stories in it that kind of start to play into some of these other NVC skills, which is another thing that wasn't necessarily intentional when I designed it. But as I began to collect the stories, I realized like, oh, wow, this really shows how self-empathy, you know, front-loading a certain dynamic with some self-empathy supports there being more ease in showing up with empathy in the conversation. Or, wow, in this story, empathy really leads to honest expression. And, you know, and so it's just true in communication in NVC, and we talk about this a lot as trainers and facilitators, that it's a dance. You know, like giving empathy isn't something you just step into and then in a regular conversation, you're going to be integrating honesty, and you're going to be stepping back every so often and going like, okay, what's happening in here? Like doing some self-empathy. And for those that have, you know, can kind of see through that lens, you'll notice that a lot of the stories really do kind of demonstrate how people are like, okay, here's what I'm thinking, here's what I'm needing, here's what I'm thinking is going on for the other person, here's what I want to say. And so, like I said, it's kind of, it kind of took on a life of its own in this way from the learning perspective. Like there's all this like interesting learning happening, and yet it's still also at the surface, just this like sweet story that, can go on a coffee table book.
Yeah.
So,
and each one of those stories is sort of like illuminating a different facet in a sense, a different facet. There's so many different facets of empathy and an empathic relationship, and each story sort of shares, sheds some light on that facet.
Yes. And shed some light, there's, your story's a good example of this. There's many stories in which people kind of have a sense of like what the default template is, so like I'm thinking about the story with you, and you're at a conference, right? And you're talking with somebody who doesn't feel like they belong, doesn't feel like they should be there, doesn't feel like they're connecting with what's being delivered and the instructions. And they're pointing out some systemic issues too, like, okay, there's, like, are you talking just to the white people in the room? Are like, can you be with me from my perspective? Like, I think this is one of those places where many people could sort of like see themselves just being very uncomfortable and like, oh gosh, this is awkward. Nobody knows what to do. People have these defaults of certain things happening and not going very well. And then they have a chance to see like, oh, okay. So, and Edwin, you just so beautifully demonstrated a very simple, like, I'm just going to reflect back what I'm hearing. Are you saying this? And giving the person a chance to say like, yeah, thank you. That's it. Or, well, it's, yeah, but it's also about that, and, without, giving too much of the juicy details away, it's like how to really get a sense of like those very simple reflections in that case, or very simple guesses, dramatically changing the outcome.
Yeah. This person was ready to walk out. They were like just
they were that close.
Yeah, close that I'm out of here. And just by listening, it just totally changed the. And I could just, and I just even remember that this person then spoke to the group about the experience, and it's like everybody was like, this person at one minute was like, like complaining, like ready to walk out, and then at the end of just being heard was like the most eloquent speaker. I mean, of depth. It was just, it was like an amazing experience.
Yeah. And so like the whole group in this case got a chance to see, that like, wow, there was no magic that happened. This person didn't go home and you didn't go home. Nobody went home and did like hours and hours of healing work to facilitate this ending. It was like, no. Like somebody went from feeling completely disenfranchised and frustrated, to actually like having the experience of like, wow, there is something for me here. I want to be here. This is potent. Like in the context of work meetings, and organizational dynamics and all the conflicts that can happen in workplaces, not to mention families and working with kids, there's plenty of stories of that too. But these are the kinds of things that I think are important, because it's like, at work, they think, well, gosh, how are we going to make space for this kind of stuff when we're thinking about, do we have time for the soft skills? Like, sounds nice, but I don't know. We've got the bottom line here. And it's like, well, when people start to see how efficient, if people have a need for efficiency and effectiveness, like changing.
That's a great term, empathic efficiency.
That's right.
That'll go over with businesses.
Yeah. That's one of the major ways I frame it is I say, like this is an investment, but like there's research on Dean Killian and a crew did some really cool research when she was working with an organization, kind of like over a period of time, a 6-month organization. They found that meeting times were reduced by up to 50%, and they needed fewer of them, and people were more satisfied with their work. There's all this evidence of of like the tangible impact of empathy. And again, you don't have to be like amazing at it in order for it to work. You can just start to, implement a couple of things and notice a big difference.
So you have, I was just opening up the book, the chapters. So you have different sections. So one is empathy at home, so we had talked about that. Mm-hmm. And then you've got the empathy at work. So how do you create those cultures of empathy and compassion at work? And so there's a bunch of stories, real stories about that. And the community one too. You have a section on that. Want to say anything about that one too? The community?
The community. Yeah. Well, this is one of the places where I think it's so powerful to practice connection skills, because we don't live in small villages anymore where people know each other. And especially in larger cities, or even sometimes in smaller cities, there can be this sort of experience of like, just keep to yourself, and if something's going on, mind your own business, so on. But, it's, it's really, some of those stories are incredible. The one that comes to mind right off the top of my head is actually a story of a person who used empathy when he was at gunpoint. He literally had somebody who was, a little bit certainly a lot upset, was triggered, was a little agitated because of any number of things that the story kind of goes into, but was holding a gun to his head. And the author, had the presence of mind to go like, wow, you're really scared right now. Yeah, you're really upset, and engaged and got the person who was initially holding a gun to his head to start talking about, like how rough it is in his neighborhood and how many of his friends he's seen these lives devastated by drugs and, alcohol and all of, so on and so forth. And by the end of the story, the person who started out with a gun to the other person's head is suddenly trying to help him out. Like, okay, where is it that you're needing to get to? Okay, let me, and pretty soon you've got this, this total turnaround, in which somebody that was, it was going to be another incident of violence. And suddenly you have an ally, and
moving from that disconnection and perhaps potential violence to connection and mutual understanding. And
that's right. Mm-hmm. That's right. And, for people that, as you do, I know you work a lot in, in political advocacy work. And it's like for those who are activists or working in the social justice worlds, like this kind of resource of being able to listen in a certain way to where the other side feels heard, the capacity to build bridges in this way is, to me, is not only important in terms of effectiveness, in terms of moving whatever your campaign is or whatever it is that you're organizing, moving it forward more quickly, but it's also, and you can speak to this, I'm sure, I'm kind of curious your opinion on what I'm saying. I also think that empathy skills are really essential in terms of resourcing myself as as a person who can get really drained and really frustrated by all the things that are happening in the world around these things I'm passionate about. Like this is one of the ways that when I'm in grief and mourning about all these things that are appalling or horrific for me, empathy is really supportive in terms of kind of like filling up my gas tank.
Yeah, it's just like you were talking about your family. I mean, with Alzheimer's and just, feeling heard about it and just finding that dignity is important. So that was a bit of a resource for you.
Yeah.
Okay, you mentioned the empathy tent, which you've been at before. We've set that up at political rallies. And I just set it up recently at a church. They invited us to say, oh, would you come set it up? We set it up there. And another story, a mother and her teenage son came and walked by and said, oh, we need this. And she sat down, the two of them sat down. She said, and she started sharing, her experience. Oh, we used to have a good connection. We're sort of drifting apart with my son. It's really hard to talk to him. So I just did empathic listening with her. And then till she felt heard, then I asked the son, well, how do you, what do you have to say? He says, I don't really have anything. So, so you really don't want to have much to say. So I just kind of reflected his, not wanting to speak. And just by reflecting that, he started sharing a little bit more. So, she doesn't really listen to what I say, And, then I listened to her, and she shared, oh, I feel really sad that we're losing this connection, and, really want this nice connection that we used to have. And then he says, well, I want more freedom and independence. And so the conversation went back and forth for, like 20 minutes, just them sharing and doing empathic. Then they started reflecting each other. It's that same, had them do empathic listening with each other, developed, and they really created a sense of connection. And he said, yeah, I want to have a better connection. I gave him information on how to do an empathy circle, in their family. And, they were just really grateful. And the other thing was, it felt so good to be able to contribute. Here they've been having this disconnection, and just to offer empathy, support them, and listening to each other, I could see how they were, connecting and going forward. They had some tools, for building the relationship. And it just feels really good to contribute to people's well-being in that way.
Yeah.
For me, it did.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And, I just, I wasn't planning on talking about this, but what comes to mind as you're saying that is, since we were talking about the context of social justice and advocacy, and I actually think that there's a connection between some of these systemic issues in the world and the way we parent our children, and the way that we school them, in our educational system, and and some of the defaults as adults that we have towards kids are to use power over. And we start finding by the time they've had that, into their teenage years, a lot of painful things often begin to happen, right, in terms of connection. And parents don't know what else to do because they're just doing what they learned.
Yeah.
Teachers don't know what else to do. They're just doing what they learned also. And yet there really are different ways. There's a story in the book that I often share with teachers about a group of kids. I think it was a group of second or third graders who misbehaved with the substitute. And they had a library elective, and they, some of them were writing in the books, and they were just, they kind of, they went crazy with the substitute. And so both the substitute and the librarian were upset. And when the teacher came back, again, this is one of those things where everybody has a template about what you would expect to happen in that case, to find out who did what, and there'd be consequences of different sorts being doled out. But instead, what this teacher did, she used this sort of framework. It's an NBC-based framework developed by Sir Hart and Victoria Kendall Hodson, called the No-Fault Zone. And so the kids have these placemats, and they have these different cards. And so they're like, all right, let's get out the cards. And so they first started out by doing what is essentially self-empathy, all right, what was going on for you that day? And instead of saying all right, who did what? And who was it that wrote on that wall? All the kids had a chance to say what their experience was. A couple of those that had technically vandalized parts of the library, said well, I was really confused that day, and it was hot, and I didn't know what we were doing, and I was antsy, and the teacher just said, okay. And, they spent a fair amount of time with it, and this wasn't something that happened, instantly. It took a period of, a class period, so half hour to an hour. But what happened, and this is one of the things that Marshall Rosenberg, the founder of NBC, used to talk about so much, is that once people are more self-connected, they naturally start to want to connect with others, and they naturally want to give. So these kids once they felt heard for however they were feeling and the frustration and this and that, and they were needing more clarity and they were needing more structure and this, so forth, then they started to empathize with the substitute and the librarian. And they said, yeah, we're feeling bad. They were probably needing support, and they were probably needing listening from us, and we didn't do that. And then the kids on their own decided that they wanted to write a letter to both of those teachers, and then they came up with a plan for how they were going to kind of repair things with the librarian who was, on campus all the time. And like, what a powerful way to, to really find something that's intrinsic in the kids versus saying like, okay, we're going to write a letter to those teachers now and you're going to sign it.
Right. And we're just going to do it because we're told to do it. We're going to pretend we're sorry because we don't really care, but
that's right.
We're kind of being forced to do it. And here's sort of a genuine.
Yeah. And so this way of setting up a whole new template for both the kids and the adults, that's like, wow, our needs can get met if we start by listening to the kids. The kids understand that they're going to be hurt. Like, these are things that have profound implications, not only in terms of those specific relationships, but I would argue that these kinds of shifts in terms of working with kids have major implications systemically in terms of what we see as some of the major challenges we have in our societies with our government and, with various institutions that are hierarchical in power over, so it's like we're really doing something revolutionary when we teach a parent how to connect with their kid.
Yeah, it's moving from that power over to a power with, and a sort of, I call it a culture of empathy. So it's really a whole different culture that is like you were sharing about your experience. You're empathizing with yourself. You'd received empathy about your parents' condition. You're listening to them. You're talking with the healthcare workers, trying to empathize with them, requesting empathy. So really creating a whole sort of an empathic way of being.
Right.
And and I think the book contributes to that. I mean, it's like by hearing all these stories, you see all the different ways that you can build,
that's right,
how people are building that.
Yeah.
Culture.
And often as a single driver. In other words, you can build an entire culture of empathy, even being, in some cases, the only person with a conscious skill set. Because everybody has that natural desire to give and to open their hearts. And so like as one person, like most of us don't have the same privilege that I have as, in terms of like, a partner with NVC skills, is fantastic. And when you do have that, it is, is really lovely. But many of my students, of course, are the only ones that they know with NVC skills. And so it's important to know that you can create that whole culture of empathy just by starting to put out the first ripple. And it begins to, in certain ways, start to show up in all of the different stakeholders in a certain situation. And you can do this as a single driver.
Yeah, I should mention that you mentioned NVC, Nonviolent Communication. So maybe give a bit of a context that was founded by Marshall Rosenberg. And he was a student of Carl Rogers, who did a lot of work on empathic listening. And then Marshall Rosenberg sort of built on that, kind of built more tools, more practices, more insights about the nature of empathy. So the book is sort of comes more from that out of the nonviolent communications community. So I think most of the contributors have sort of that background and that training.
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah.
They do. It's kind of a niche. And again, like the people that I think are going to be interested are going to be the students who are brand new to NVC and trying to figure out what does this really look like, out there in realistic conversations, what can I actually expect? and then just as I do, NVC trainers or people that are trying to introduce it to other people at work, formally or informally, can use these stories as ways of sort of demonstrating key concepts and saying like, all right, so, in here it's going to feel a little clunky because it's like we're starting to put this alphabet together for the first time. And, it is like learning a foreign language when you're kind of monotone and you're thinking real hard and it's important to have a sense of like what we're working towards, what it starts to sound like when it's a bit more skilled, a bit more integrated.
Well,
Yeah.
I've interviewed a lot of authors on empathy. In fact, I have like 2 rows of books. They're all books on empathy, but a lot of them are more sort of academic, talking about. So I think this is like a huge contribution. It's all stories. I don't know how many are there.
It's over 70.
70 stories about people actually their real experience of empathy and sharing it in a storytelling format. So I see it as a huge, really important contribution. And I don't know, are you going to keep creating these stories going forward, or is this kind of the
yeah, that's a good question. It was originally sort of this thought in my head that like, I wonder what it would be like to collect restorative justice stories or stories that are just about self-empathy. I'm kind of just like waiting to see what kind of happens organically with that. I'm not sure. What I am sure about is that there are certain ways I do want to build out the book and start to link it for people that say, want to do an informal study group. Okay, we can read this story and then we're going to practice this little micro skill this week, and something that people, again, who just want to see changes in their lives, but, may not have, I live in an area where there are a ton of NVC trainings and, we're near the Oakland hub of NVC and, Santa Cruz in California, but some people have a harder time accessing some of these trainings that I was able to just kind of immerse myself in when I learned. And, so I am intending to do a little bit more with training videos and so forth. So I'm going to start with that and we'll see what happens.
Great. Well, okay. Yeah. Well, that's maybe a good place to end the conversation. I really appreciate all the work you've done. It's been years of collecting these stories and putting it out there. Great to contribute a story and, look forward to, staying in contact and trying to get the word out and appreciative and grateful for this, really immense contribution to the building a culture of empathy.
Well, thank you for taking the time to ask some questions and to share with me, some of your opinions and thoughts on it too. It's been a lovely conversation.